This lightning talk is about women's veiling practices in Oman, a project sponsored by the Research Council of Oman, the TRC. I'm going to outline the purpose, the procedures, the findings and the outcomes of the project. The main purpose of the project was to examine the veiling practices of women in Oman by comparing, for example, age, region, educational level, etc., some variables that we had chosen. We wanted to connect what women were saying in Oman with the global debates that were taking place about wearing the hijab and put Oman on the map in terms of research. Finally, we wanted to present the perspectives of Muslim women to make sure that their opinions weren't excluded. In terms of methodology, we had mixed methods. So the quantitative was a survey in which we received 401 responses, and the qualitative consisted of 12 focus group interviews in which we interviewed 50 women. SurveyMonkey was used to analyze the quantitative data, and the narratives from the focus groups were analyzed using a thematic system. The sites consisted of Soha, Saham and Muscat, which are 3 coastal cities, Muscat being the capital, and we compared these to Ibri and Nizwa, which were 2 cities in the interior, to see if there were any differences between what women were saying and doing. The survey respondents were mainly young, and this is seen from the chart here, and that was because our research team itself was young, undergraduate and postgraduate students from the university. Selected findings, I'm going to look at religion, age, generation, locality, and then just list some of the other variables that we looked at. So if we start with religion, covering one's head reflects a woman's piety, one of the questions in the survey. 359 women answered this question, as some questions were skipped, and 288 of those, about 80%, agreed with this. Similarly, covering one's head is a spiritual or religious decision. 318, or almost 90% of women, agreed with this. If we look at the narratives, wearing hijab indicates Islam. A similar quote, hijab is essential and I will not let go of my hijab. Reinforcing the idea that a hijab was a religious obligation, and that the motivating factor for wearing it was indeed religion, rather than identity or political affiliation or practical measures. Age and generation, we interviewed 3 generations of women. All of them agreed that the hijab was an obligation in Islam. But they also pointed out that there were different expectations for the coming generation. So grandmothers didn't expect their granddaughters to practice veiling the way they had done so, and that indeed practices were changing with time. One example of this change is the burqa, which is the face cover traditionally worn by women when they got married. But now women felt that it was not appropriate to the lifestyles that were common in Oman, and that in fact the burqa was seen more as a fashion accessory. Locality, again there was agreement that there were differences between women's veiling practices depending on where they lived, and that region or locality influenced a woman's hijab choices. Muscat was identified as being a place where the hijab was worn differently, and indeed sometimes not worn at all. So these trends were clear from what women said, and it reflects earlier research about regional variations of women's dress and veiling practices in Oman. These are some of the other variables that I mentioned and that are detailed in the paper. Outcomes for the project, we have a website in which we look at the findings and also give some details about the research team and the field work. If anyone's interested in more detail about the methodology and of course the findings, we had a paper published earlier this year in the Interdisciplinary Journal of Cultural Studies. Limitations, of course, we could have done more. We could have analysed the data statistically in a number of other ways. We could have covered more geographical areas and gone down to the south in Salalah. We could have increased the number of women in the older cohort. So there's always more work to be done. One of the areas that I'd like to develop further was law and practice, which is something that is interesting at the moment with the debate in Western countries about the banning of the veil, the face veil, sorry. Regional variation, so looking at other countries in the Khalij, how do these compare with Oman? And also a longitudinal study would have been interesting to undertake to see how these practices are changing over time. My contact email, if anyone's interested in getting in touch and more information. Thank you very much.